If you're a fan of this channel, you likely know about DisplayPort, but not all DisplayPort ports are built equal. Let me explain. So when I say not all DisplayPorts are built equal, of course I'm not referring to the version. We all probably know that, well, there's not just one standard called DisplayPort. There's DisplayPort 1.2, which was the first one that could really do 4K 60. There's DisplayPort 1.4, which can really do most high refresh rate displays. I believe up to 8K 60 or 4K 120, although you can use display stream compression to push that way past that up to 2:1, 3:1 compression ratios. But this video is not about display, but this video is not about display stream compression or different DisplayPort versions. There's something a little more nuanced here. Let's start with something really simple. If I have the output on my GPU, and for the sake of this video, we're going to assume that this is a DisplayPort output. Obviously, the most common use case of this is this would connect onto a display. That's also DisplayPort. So if you can go full-size DisplayPort to full-size DisplayPort, obviously we expect this stuff to work. In fact, some early laptops also had DisplayPort ports before HDMI went over for whatever reason. But of course, that's expected. And also, there's different form factors, right? So you have mini DP, and you have full-size DP. Not to be confused with HDMI, which has full-size, mini, and a micro, which all carry the same signal. We have mini DP and DP, but these two are the same signaling standard. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about are the special use cases where you end up turning DisplayPort into DVI or HDMI. You might say, well, why on earth would I do that? And you've likely noticed that there are a couple different signaling protocols. For example, you have probably seen that you can have an HDMI computer, such as a desktop or a laptop, and that can go back and forth with DVI-D, typically single link, and there's no problems there. I can go the other way around. I can have an HDMI monitor hooked up to a DVI computer. So just to make that clear, this is a two-way relationship. And I don't need active adapters. Of course, all of this is possible with active adapters. You can go HDMI to VGA, VGA to HDMI, but those are all active. They use fundamentally different signaling schemes, so we need the use of active adapters to convert them. HDMI to VGA obviously being digital to analog conversion, VGA to HDMI being an analog to digital conversion. So this works. You've also likely seen that you can go DisplayPort on a computer to HDMI on a monitor. That also works. You do not need active adapters to do this. In fact, you can also go DP to DVI. That is also perfectly valid. You also do not need any active adapters to do that. But you would have likely noticed that these adapters aren't bidirectional. I cannot hook up HDMI on a computer to a DisplayPort display. You might have tried this with HDMI on a laptop going to a DisplayPort monitor. That will not work. You will also see that DVI on a desktop cannot be converted to DisplayPort. So that might seem a little strange, right? So here we have HDMI going back and forth with DVI, but these are only going one way. And they're all using passive adapters, right? So like, well, what's the difference? That's a passive adapter. So clearly, like, the pins and signaling are the same, right? Well, that's where you would be mistaken. And this is what I mean by there's a hidden version of DisplayPort that you've used likely without ever thinking about it, but that isn't always a given. And this can lead to some interesting cases. Now, the entire premise behind this was I was helping someone troubleshoot an adapter. And we'll get back to how that's going to play into all of this. So this works, and we said that the reverse is not true. And there's a very good reason for this. It's not just that they're scamming you for your money by making you buy active adapters. HDMI and DVI-D use the same digital encoding. So it's possible to go back and forth. They actually are carrying the same signal, albeit slightly different timings, like DVI-D can only go up to 2560 by 1600, cannot do 4K 60, ... Obviously, DVI doesn't carry audio by default, it carries video only. But also, but these two standards, HDMI more so, DVI is the earlier standard, so it didn't decide. But when HDMI was being designed, one of the fundamental aspects was that it would be backwards and forwards compatible with DVI, probably to help ease the transition. So while they might not be the exact same encoding, you can do this without any problems, other than, of course, resolution limits. And yes, DVI doesn't have like audio return channels or Ethernet over the cable, so on and so forth. I'm not talking about those. Those are a different video. We can talk about what a mess HDMI is with all of those. That's completely separate. But essentially, they use an encoding scheme that's fundamentally compatible between the two. By the way, these typically are all just low voltage differential signaling, LVDS. You've probably seen LVDS before EDP became a thing, and maybe that's a little bit of foreshadowing with what's about to come here. Now, these actually shouldn't work at all, right? So I want to make that very... So now we come back to this side. In principle, neither of these should work, because DisplayPort uses a fundamentally different encoding scheme compared to the other digital formats. Now, what do I mean by like fundamentally different encoding scheme? I've talked about how HDMI and DVI use a form of differential signal encoding, but that's beyond the point of this. The key point is that DisplayPort actually uses packets. So whereas these guys are just converting a single video stream and sending it as a digital format, DisplayPort has a lot more going on under the hood. It also comes down to how, so DisplayPort, by the way, also has a lot of different side channels for transmitting information. For example, DPCD is a common one that's used across most of these. Well, obviously, DisplayPort, so DisplayPort, control, whatever. But DisplayPort uses packets. And if you've seen some of the features of DisplayPort, that would make sense. For example, you might have noticed that you can actually do weird things with it. For example, if I have my GPU, just like our previous diagram here, outputting DP, I can go to one monitor, out from that monitor, and into a second monitor. Note that these are not both running separately from the GPU. That would obviously work. I can daisy chain DisplayPort signals. Now, if you're thinking about this as a single digital video stream, think about how that might work. How does each monitor know how to interpret its own data, right? If this was encoded as one big single video stream, it's like, oh, well, I guess this one crops the left half of the image and that one crops the right half of the image. That's not really how it works. Instead, because DisplayPort uses the idea of sending video streams as individual packets, just like networking does. So say these are our video packets going. Again, I've made videos about how packets work with regards to layer 2, layer 3, like network switching and routing and so on and so forth. But essentially, we're going to use a similar concept where just like how with traditional internet network, we can have packets that are designed to go to different MAC addresses for layer 2, and in layer 3 we have different IP addresses for IPv4 and IPv6. We can have different packets that go to each of the monitors. So the GPU can output all of these and say, hey, that's for monitor 1, this is for monitor 2, this is for monitor 1. And monitor 1 can look at it and it's smart enough to know, oh, hey, these are the video packets that are coming to me. Oh yeah, those ones aren't for me. Let's pass those through to the next monitor. Now, of course, this doesn't mean you cannot exceed the maximum bandwidth of the first cable, right? I cannot, if this is DisplayPort 1.2, but I'm not gonna run too high refresh rate, like 4K streams off of this. You are going to be limited there because you can only send so many packets at set clock speeds. But the point is, you can do stuff like this, which isn't possible with DVI and HDMI because, this is one of the advantages of using a more modern encoding scheme. Okay, when I say encoding in this video, I think hopefully you guys know what I'm referring to. I'm not referring to necessarily like Huffman encoding versus little endian versus big endian. I'm not talking about that type of encoding. I'm talking about how we're sending the digital video signal, in case it's not clear. All right, back to our main thing here. So DisplayPort uses packets. These guys use traditional video signaling. So how do these adapters work, right? So it is completely conceivable that you would have an active adapter that would do this, right? So you can have DP going in, goes into this black box, accepts packets, and then a traditional, video stream comes out. And yeah, there are active adapters that do this. In fact, you might have to use some of these depending on your bandwidth requirements, or if you're going certain distance, or if you need certain features. But this means active adapters means that there's some processing happening here, right? Like I have a black box, some bit stream is going in and some different bit stream is coming out. Those passive adapters aren't like that. Anyway, I'm beating around the bush a little here, but basically, these cables aren't anything special. When I say they're passive, they're literally just the pins connected. So what actually happens is that instead of this black box happening here, the black box happens before any of these signals ever came to be in the GPU. Now, of course that makes sense, right? The GPU is the one that generates the video signals. If it's going to generate an HDMI signal, it can do so. If it's going to generate a DisplayPort signal, it can do so. The AMD equivalent would be the display abstraction layer. The whole point of that is that once you have a frame that is ready to be sent to the display, we abstract all of that, hence the abstraction layer, and that entire segment of the driver, which is open source by the way, will encode it into HDMI display, whatever this signal needs to be. And in fact, these will typically be done with hardware, so the driver will just tell the hardware, do it this way, because you can assume that we're not rendering 4K 160 in real time to send. It's all hardware. But essentially, these cables work because the smart bit happens inside the GPU. It also means there's a couple of quirks, right? If I convert DP to a DVI or something, and then I try, I don't know, for whatever reason, you try playing a DP signal to the end of it, and that would probably work because of the way the GPU detects what's connected. But essentially, you can run into some of these funky issues where the GPU has to figure out what's connected, right? If I use a DP to DP cable connected to a DP input on a monitor, the GPU's got to go, oh, right, this is a DisplayPort stream. We need to encode this video using DisplayPort so that we can send it off to the display. But if I connect an HDMI TV, for example, or I connect the projector in this room, or the camera that's, it needs to be smart enough to figure out, oh, wait, we have one of these two other systems, and take care of that. So collectively, this feature of DisplayPort being able to output both DisplayPort video signals, as well as backwards compatible regular digital signals for DVI or HDMI, is called DisplayPort dual mode. So you might have seen this called DP++ on the box of your GPU or on some of the ports. So if you look at the back of your video card, and when I say GPU, by the way, this isn't specific to dedicated gaming GPUs. If you have a laptop, this is, or if you're using a DisplayPort output from an EPU, this is still valid. But you might have seen, instead of the normal DP writing on the back of your card, you might have seen the word DP++. And you might have wondered what the plus plus is. Is this C, C++? We have DP, DP++, DP++ is object-oriented. No, what it's actually referring to is DP++ stands for DisplayPort dual mode. And why is it called dual mode? Well, it can operate in DP mode, or it can operate in DVI/HDMI mode. But this little feature is what ends up causing some headaches if you're not on a GPU that supports DP++. Let's think about what happens if I'm on a laptop. If I'm on a laptop, my output is probably a USB Type-C port these days, if you're going to run DisplayPort. Now, USB Type-C has multiple different distinct alt modes. What do I mean when I say alt mode, right? So USB Type-C typically operates in USB mode. Fair enough. USB 2.0, USB 3.0. You get the picture of it. I'm not talking about USB 4, Thunderbolt, and PCIe tunneling in this video. That's a whole separate hour-long discussion. We have USB Type-C. Type-C essentially, though, has several distinct alt modes. For example, you can allocate some of the pins that would normally be used for sending USB data to send video data. This is distinct from Thunderbolt docks that have video outputs. Just to make that very clear, you can have Thunderbolt docks that use the Thunderbolt or USB 4, whatever you want to call it, alt mode, which can or cannot, or at least for USB 4, may or may not include PCIe tunneling, but PCIe tunneling is basically what Thunderbolt has been, except copyright by Intel and Apple. So you can have Type-C going to using Thunderbolt or USB 4 to a dock, and that dock then goes to your separate DP monitors. That's not the alt mode I'm talking about. The alt mode I'm talking about is the one you see everywhere else on all of your common dongles. So what an alt mode does is, see, Thunderbolt and stuff is really expensive because you need chips to decode that and then re-encode it. Expensive means they're not going to do it. So alt mode basically takes some of the wires that would be allocated for USB typically and allocates them to either HDMI or DisplayPort. Now, here's another fun doozy for you. If I have one of the little dongles here that has an HDMI port on it, what alt mode should this be using? You might think that, well, if it's going Type-C to HDMI, surely it uses the HDMI alt mode. And you might be right in some cases, but in most cases you will be wrong. It does not use the HDMI alt mode. Instead, most dongles that you see with HDMI use the DisplayPort alt mode. Which, by the way, if you didn't know this, if you tried connecting one that uses the HDMI out mode to like some ARM computers, maybe it didn't work because a lot of ARM SoCs don't actually support the HDMI alt mode over Type-C. They only support the DisplayPort alt mode. I don't know why. I've seen this at least on particular Android TV boxes that use rock chip SoCs, but I'm sure this extends well beyond those. Even ones with HDMI ports use DisplayPort alt mode, which is good because that's what is more universally supported. But then you might say, okay, well, I might be able to get kicked out here. We'll see. We have DisplayPort converting to HDMI. And you might assume that, hey, you just talked about DisplayPort dual mode. So obviously this should use DisplayPort dual mode, right? As it's to allow you to send a DisplayPort HDMI stream over a DisplayPort port. However, that's also not typically the case. Because here's a key part. The DisplayPort alt mode on Type-C typically does not support dual mode. There's actually two distinctions. There's whether the port may or may not, and whether how it's going to do encoding. And there's also whether your dongle is going to allow you. A lot of, as you can see, there's a lot of, if we're like making a tree out of this, there's a lot of different distinct possibilities. You know what, I'll leave this up just for reference. For me, this only really became relevant because I had USB-C on my laptop. And something you might have noticed, by the way, is that if it's using the DisplayPort alt mode, it can use both 2 DisplayPort lanes or 4 DisplayPort lanes. You might say lanes, so it's literally exactly what it sounds like. If I have 4 lanes, I can send 4x the original, single lane amount of data. If I have 2 lanes, I can send 2x the original amount of data. So you might say, why does this matter? Sounds like I'm getting into more random technical details, which, let's be fair, I am. But I got 20% battery left on this computer, so might as well get a couple more things in. DisplayPort 2 lane on most configurations using DisplayPort 1.2. If it's converted to HDMI, that is equivalent to HDMI 1.4. This means that a lot of dongles you see with HDMI, if they are using USB 3.0, historically have been capped 4K 24 Hz or 1440p 60. And that gets annoying, of course. Now, you might say, well, that's easy. Why don't they use the 4-lane version that can send double the amount of data? Well, here's the thing. Sending 4 lanes means I need 2 more pairs of wires. Conveniently, USB 3.0 happens to use 2 additional pairs of wires on top of USB 2.0. So historically, if you're making like a dongle, you have to make a choice. If you wanted the equivalent of HDMI 2.0, which no one's going to do because HDMI has licensing fees, if I use DisplayPort 2 lane, I can convert that to HDMI 1.4, or I can keep it as DisplayPort. That'll run 4K 24, which has been typically enough for most people, because most people, when they convert to HDMI, they're not plugging in high refresh rate displays, they're plugging in a TV or a projector for a presentation. But if you're trying to use this as a hub at home, you can see why this might get a little annoying, especially if you're trying to run like a 4K 60 monitor. So in those cases, I've had to hunt out dock/hubs that specifically use DisplayPort 4 lane, which would let you get that. However, that means that you typically give up USB 3.0 and you're back to USB 2.0. And those typically won't be offered as HDMI ports. Now, of course, a lot of this has been solved by modern laptops. This was in the era when I was using my previous laptop, which for whatever reason, Lenovo decided to use HDMI 1.4 instead of 2.0, even though the APU supported HDMI 2.0. Kind of puzzling why they do that on a ThinkPad of all laptop series, but on most modern laptops you will not have this issue simply because they support the higher clock speeds, higher bit rates, and they can do whatever you need it to do without having these issues. So if I have Type-C going through the DisplayPort alt mode, and it actually ends up in a DisplayPort port. So this is exactly like the hub I'm using. This DisplayPort might not support dual mode, and typically it won't, because dual mode has to be recognized by the GPU, because remember, it's not really the port. Like the end of the GPU basically has to detect, hey, you've connected an adapter. So like we need to actually send digital video instead of packets. And in most of these cases, that coordination will not happen between the two, which means this will always be receiving packets. So when did I find this out? Well, I used my USB Type-C to DisplayPort adapter, and then on the DisplayPort end, I connected a DP to HDMI or DP to DVI passive cable, right? And this doesn't work. And for a long time, I was puzzled by, wait, what do you mean? Like, I plug this cable into my desktop, converts DisplayPort to DVI, I don't have any issues, it works perfectly fine. I take that same cable, I connect it to the DisplayPort on this, and I'm not asking something demanding. Like, this can do 4K 60. I'm just trying to get 1080p 60 off the DVI cable. Why isn't this working? And the reason is, Somewhere along this chain, you lose DisplayPort dual mode support, which means that this DisplayPort is literally just DisplayPort. It cannot send backwards compatible digital video streams. What that means is you go back to having the X's here, where you cannot do these passive video conversions. Because as I said, there's no conversion happening here. The whole logic has been on the GPU side, detecting that, oh, you've plugged in a special type of display. Let's send legacy video signals. And if that doesn't happen, this won't work. And maybe you spent time troubleshooting this. I don't really see DisplayPort dual mode being advertised or talked about at all, which is kind of what makes this confusing. Just like the USB Type-C alt modes. Like, no one talks about whether their dongle uses the DP alt mode or the HDMI alt mode. And if they're using DP, whether they're using 2 lanes or 4 lanes. No one seems to care. That whole thing has led to a bit of this confusing, well, whatever this is, confusion, I guess, with regards to what's happening here. Hopefully this video has helped you clarify a bit. Maybe you, as I said, maybe you've been trying to troubleshoot this and now it just clicked for you that this is why your adapters and dongles haven't been working. Either way, thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned something from this video. I hope it has been informative for you. Thank you so much for watching till the end. Even on this, what was supposed to be a 5-minute video, just saying, hey, by the way, there's DP++, we reached 28 minutes of recording time. Thank you so much. If you'd like to see more videos like this in the future, consider subscribing to my channel or leaving a like down below. Thank you, and I will see you next time.